Hey there, everyone. So, as the war in Gaza has continued to escalate and take shape today, especially after the October 7th escalation, it's become increasingly clear to do a video talking about violence in anti-imperialist struggles, because in many senses, many of the Palestinian people, apart from Hamas, are perfectly willing to accept the possibility of violent resistance as the only way to secure their land now, as Israel, a properly imperialist power propped up by the US and Britain and France at one point, has shifted the balance of global power in that region. And an exemplary figure for talking about anti-imperialist struggle and the role of violence in these struggles is Ulrike Meinhof. Today we're going to be looking at Meinhof's essay, Armed Anti-Imperialist Struggle, and the defensive position of the counter-revolution in its psychologic warfare against the people. Now, Ulrike Meinhof was a German journalist and later founder of the RAF, or the Rote Armee Fraktion, or the Red Army faction, which was a far-left, communist, Marxist-Leninist, anti-imperialist, anti-fascist group. And in this essay, Meinhof gives us a lot of very detailed thoughts about the relationship between kind of peaceful protest versus armed resistance and struggle. But I think it's important to note just a few points about her life. She had been contributing to various magazines and papers, and in 1968, Rudi Deutschke, who was a member of the SDS, which is the Students for Democratic Socialism, which was a college student group primarily at that time fighting against U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War. And Rudi Deutschke was killed, and as such, Ulrike Meinhof wrote in Concret, which was a paper that she had been writing in, "Protest is when I say this does not please me. Resistance is when I ensure that what does not please me occurs no more." So clearly, she's got this very words are one thing and action is another. And for her, action is virtually superfluous when it comes to protest. And of course, this is all, she's a very extreme figure. So just keep that in mind throughout. Like, you don't have to agree with everything she says. I don't agree with everything she says. But it's important to have this range of opinions, which, by the way, you can find this essay in Semiotext's lovely volume, Hatred of Capitalism, edited by Chris Kraus and Sylvia Lottringe. And as Meinhof was protesting the Vietnam War, she met Andreas Baader and Gudrun Estlin, who, with her, helped to found the RAF. Now, Meinhof was, throughout her life, engaged in all sorts of criminal activity aimed to help the RAF basically fight against the German state. Because after World War II, Meinhof and others around her were very disillusioned with the fact that many in German society weren't willing to accept the role of the ordinary person in being complicit with the action of the Nazis. This is a topic that, for example, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari talk about in Anti-Oedipus, that we commonly like to think that people were duped into accepting fascism, but the much more troubling aspect is that fascism is attractive in a sense, and that under the right conditions, people will desire fascism and indeed their own oppression. And as such, Ulrike Meinhof engaged in murder, grand theft auto in order to gain money for weapons and whatnot, and famously engaged in breaking Andreas Baader out of Stammheim prison. That is a big deal because Stammheim is one of the most high-security prison facilities in the entire world. It basically occurred when they convinced the Stammheim prison authorities to move Baader to a different location, and in the process of that, they apprehended Baader and got him. So that is going to be an important element in this essay, where she talks, for example, about the event on May 14th, 1970, when they freed Baader, and how Baader represents the movement that she stands for. In opening this essay, she writes, "Anti-Imperialist Struggle, if not meant to be merely a phrase, aims at destroying the imperialist system of powers, politically, economically, and in militaristic terms. The cultural institutions through which imperialism provides homogeneity of the ruling elites and the communication systems for its ideological predomination." So we see right there that she's making very explicit that the current state apparatus as it exists at this time in Germany, this is the early 70s, and there's not actually a date written on this, so I don't exactly know when it is, but she did another speech called Anti-Imperialist Struggle in 1974, so I'm assuming it's around this time, prior to her own imprisonment and subsequent death, unfortunately. But she's making very explicit that the German state at this time is imperialist and indeed fascistic in a sense. And as such, she wants to focus on the relationship of anti-fascism and anti-imperialism to a process of what she calls proletarian internationalism, which requires this collective buildup of the mentality of we need to actually recognize our complicity in a lot of the state's action, and as such, it's not just a national struggle for Meinhof. It's not a French Revolution, we need to overthrow this oppressive power in the name of the nation. Instead, it's in the interest of principles that are more internationalist, which would make sense according to her communist leanings, for example. And she mentions that all these various anti-imperialist struggles exist, from the Red Army faction to the Brigata Rossa in Italy to the United People's Liberation in the US, and various anti-imperialist movements in Africa, for example, and in the Third World generally, and mentions that one of the pros to doing these kind of struggles in the quote-unquote First World is that you attack imperialism from behind, and that you can make substantive change to, as she mentioned, the intelligence apparatus and the sort of stuff that is actually controlling the ability of an imperialist state to centralize. And Meinhof mentions that the term national state is a fiction. It no longer has any reality within the metropoles. And she argues that, in fact, considering the way that even people in the First World are treated, which is something that Meinhof is going to take issue with, is the fact that it's, in many senses, it's not that much better in the First World, which, this may be a very privileged position that she's coming from, but also she's very aware of the struggles people are engaging in, and particularly the left in Germany at this time during the Cold War, considering that you had Western and Eastern Berlin split across these capitalist communist lines. Leftism in West Germany was very, very not only taboo, but had very limited media freedom. And as such, she mentions through internationalization of capital, through the news media, through reciprocal dependencies of economic development, through enlargement of the European community, through crisis, an internationalism of the proletariat in Europe now emanates even on the subjective level. European trade unions have been working for years at its suppression, institutionalization, and control. And this is a trend that a lot of kind of postmodern thinkers have seen too. I think of like Paul Virilio, for example, who mentions the fact that as economies and societies are developing, there's this increased dependency on movement and on controlling movement and regulating that movement, and that internationalism and globalism is kind of the defining trend of the 20th and now 21st century. And as such, Meinhof sees the notion of a nationalist state as essentially a revisionist way to keep peoples restricted to a very narrow notion of what imperialism means, namely that it only acts within the state. In fact, she wants to point out that stuff is going on within our own countries, and that it merely being worse other places doesn't make it less necessary to engage in struggles on the home front, so to speak. She argues that this notion that the masses are not ready yet reminds us not that the RAF and captured revolutionaries in isolation, in special prison selections, in artificial brainwash collectives, and in prison, only of the arguments of the colonial pigs in Africa and Asia over 70 years. So she mentions here that this notion that people aren't ready yet, that they need to, somehow mature in their political tendencies, for example, it's relatively patronizing, and it's definitely the kind of argument that was used against, as she says, black people, illiterates, slaves, the colonized, tortured, suppressed, starving, that people suffering under colonialism were not yet ready to take their bureaucracy, their school system, their future as human beings into their own hands. That this is the kind of argument that people who are worried about their own positions of power are concerned with, as she says. That in fact, it's not actually aimed at liberation, but it's aimed at containment, by basically always having a worse place to point to and say that, oh, as such, you just need to be happy with what you have, and you need to sit back and be calm. Things will change eventually. And Meinhof, considering that, Hitler's Nazi Germany is well within memory, she doesn't ever want that to happen again. And she's thinking about the complicity that people have as Germany becomes, more industrialized, more modernized, more internationalist, that despite this, people's working conditions can still, be a real issue. People's struggles with the state can be a real issue in terms of having their voices heard. And as such, she wants to appeal to this internationalism to get us out of a narrow conception of what liberation looks like. And when it comes back to, for example, the situation in Palestine and Gaza right now, internationalism is a critical element in actually getting something to change, because the Palestinian people really, they don't have many means to self-determination or proper political resistance when it comes to opposing the Israeli government or the IDF. And as such, it requires people like, maybe Meinhof might think it's a very facile gesture, but Nelson Mandela wearing a keffiyeh, right? These statements of solidarity, and also indeed the presence of that solidarity in international courts. And Meinhof would likely argue that it requires, actual military action of like building tunnels under shit and getting stuff done. But nevertheless, she points out, when it comes to freeing Andres Bada in May 14th of 1970, that he stood for what a revolutionary person ought to be, precisely because he was able to engage in this collective process of learning, of collective leadership, of passing on collective processes to every individual. And this notion of the kind of the urban guerrilla and the international proletariat, Meinhof is careful to phrase this in a way in which it is very much not a stable entity. This is a common kind of misreading of Marxism in general, which I must confess I was victim to in the past, that the proletariat is this very defined entity. In some ways it is. It's a question of who owns the means of production. Also who has political power and rights to self-determination and things like this. But if you look at politics for just a second, it's not quite that simple to determine actually where a lot of that power lies, because, today, for example, in the 2008 crisis with the stock market collapsing, it was very difficult to know exactly who was at fault, because you've got all these elites that were complicit and involved in letting stuff go under the rug. And, they ended up not prosecuting nearly as many people involved in it as possible. But one could question, how many people would they need to do something to for something to change? It's such an internationalist system, as Meinhof is mentioning, that oftentimes these very individual points don't really provide much of a foundation until they are put in the context of this internationalist process. And with regard to actually breaking Andrés Bada out of prison, she says the action was exemplary because anti-imperialist struggle deals with liberation of prisoners as such from the prison, which the system has always signified for all exploited and suppressed groups of the people. From the imprisonment of total alienation and self-alienation, from political and existential martial law, in which the people are forced to live within the grip of imperialism, consumer culture, media, the controlling apparatuses of the ruling class, dependent on the markets and the state apparatus. So, the freeing of Bada represents, for Meinhof, the plight that every person is subject to in the modern world of, being reduced to this abstract instrument of labor that can be shuttled around, and now today that one's information can be controlled and targeted towards them in order to extract from them, the ability to consume more. And as such, she wants to focus on the ability to take decided action to, as she says, leave the level of lethargy, verbal radicalism, strategic discussions which become more and more non-substantial in order to fight. It only becomes evident at this point what kind of a person one is. The metropole individual is discovered. He or she comes from the process of decay, the false, alienated surroundings of living in the system. So, the very existence of these poor conditions, obviously, this is like standard Marxism, is that in these moments, the contradictions between the people and the state, which supposedly stands for the people, is put starkly and in a way that will incite, something actually being done about the state collapsing under its own weight. And that notion of under its own weight is going to be a prevailing theme throughout this essay of how can one actually engage in personal struggle, real struggle, in such a way that it will escalate these contradictions. She writes, "But that is us. That is where we come from. Bred by the processes of elimination in metropole society, by the war of all against all, the competition between each and everybody else, the system of fear and pressure of productivity, the game of one at the expense of somebody else, the separation of people into men and women, young and old, healthy and sick, foreigners and natives, the fight for reputation. That is where we come from. From the isolation of the suburban home, the desolate, concreted public housing, the cell prisons, asylums, and special prison sections. We come to the guerrilla organization brainwashed through the media, consumerism, physical punishment, and the ideology of nonviolence. From depression, sickness, declassification, insult, and humiliation of the individual, of all exploited people under imperialism. And I think this is a particularly apt paragraph for talking about anti-imperialist and anti-fascist struggles in general, is that, for example, in the conflict in Gaza right now, everyone's like, well, I don't like violence, so even though the Palestinian people are in a bad situation, we just need to, reach a ceasefire, and then we need to reach two-state solution. And of course, the very injustice of the two-state solution is the assumption of the Israeli state's legitimacy as an existent entity, because of course they are the very existence of Israel is built on the backs of the imperialist dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the cutting up of the Middle East. And, Israel really acts as a station point to, for example, have relations with Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq. And as such, there is a hidden assumption within the notion of nonviolence that actually is a form of violence in its own right. It is a form of complicity which is able to teach one to be comfortable in one's isolated cell in modern society. And this allegory really this analogy between Stammheim and the prison of everyday life is an important factor in guiding Meinhof's mindset when she says that we understand there's nothing to lose by destroying this system through armed struggle, but everything to win. Our collective liberation, life, humanity, identity. And, this is obviously a very extreme statement, but we must keep in mind the immediate historical context of Nazi Germany, of fascism being something which shocked the entirety of the German people in various ways, either through their explicit opposition or through their implicit complicity with fascism. And as such, people like Meinhof are standing in the wake of this and saying, well, look at all these conditions, it's like we've taken one step forward and two steps back. Like we're continuing on in a fascist race, essentially, and nothing is being done about it. And as such, she wants to put forward the notion of the people's struggle rather than the establishment of a party bureaucracy. And this is an important element which really signals the shift away from a Leninist kind of, this notion of the party bureaucracy, of Mao's democratic centralism. And instead of this, it's a focus not on abstracting proletarian struggles into the form of a state apparatus, but instead letting it continue on the ground in such a way where she says urban guerrillas in the Metropole Federal Republic cannot have a centralistic apparatus. We are not a party, but a political militaristic organization developing our leadership collectively from every single group, with the tendency to dissolve it within the groups, within collective learning. And I think this notion of collective learning is a really important aspect of what modern anti-imperialist, anti-fascist political organizations actually look like, because they're trying to avoid the authoritarian tendency to reduce to new hierarchies and instead build a political faction, as is the case, that's why the RAF uses the term fraction. That in constructing a group in such a way, it really is this collectively changing mass, which is similar to the rhizome in Deleuze and Guattari's work. It's also similar to Judith Butler's liminal politics of gender, where identity is always tentative and it serves as the basis for reterritorialization, for deterritorialization, for an active operationalization and organization, which is, both of these are active processes of individuals in a collective orientation. And I think this is interesting to look at in modern politics when she writes that authoritarian structures of leadership lack material basis in the guerrilla, because the true, i.e. voluntary development of the productive energy of every individual contributes to the effectiveness of the revolutionary guerrilla, to be able to intervene in a revolutionary way, to unleash the people's war. So for her, the insistence that violence is something which can be taken up by individuals and that we shouldn't reduce to pacifism, for her, this is the guarantee against authoritarian structures, is not falling for the notion that we all just need to come and start creating this globalist order of kumbaya. Instead, she wants to keep that notion of always feigning any notion of leadership in the sense of a hierarchy in exchange for, we have people like Andreas Baader who act as kind of a vision for what an attitude of collective learning looks like, but he doesn't necessarily have much more power than, any other person in the RAF necessarily, other than, having a media presence. But I do wonder how, for example, the Taliban fits into this. Because as far as I'm concerned, the Taliban is an authoritarian structure. It is an Islamist organization aimed at the implementation of a very strict notion of fiqh, of Islamic jurisprudence, of how to implement the Sharia. And it's only gotten more and more stringent on women. And as far as I'm concerned, the Taliban is a mix of the ulama, which is to say the kind of Sunni clerics, and guerrilla fighters. Same thing with ISIL. So I wonder, with the development of modern terrorism today, considering the ability for revolutionary struggle to exist in this liminal way and still be oppressive, if this might poke a little bit of a hole in the notion that just the ability to be a guerrilla fighter in and of itself will help to fight against this sort of democratic centralism, as she mentions. Because, the Taliban certainly loves to say that, well, of course we're democratic. We're using God's words and putting it into action, and everyone loves it. No women are oppressed. And, then you actually look at the material conditions, and it's not so. Now, one of the really important additions into this essay is her talks about psychological warfare, in which the power of the state, particularly the modern states, really come to light in their ability to use, mafias, the CIA, the FBI, in order to carry out more subtle notions of imperialism, of fascism, of authoritarianism, through media control, through selectively killing certain members, through spy activities and whatnot. And Meinhof writes that psychological warfare is used by the state to set the masses against the guerrilla, to isolate the guerrilla from the people, to make the perceivable non-perceivable, the rational seemingly irrational, the humanity of revolutionaries seem inhuman. The technique is instigation, lies, dirt, racism, manipulation, mobilization of people's hidden fears, of the reflexes of existential fears of authorities, which have been burnt into the flesh through decades and centuries of colonialism and exploitative control. And this is an important element of that developing passivity that Deleuze-Guattari are so worried about, of how do people get trained, which, for Deleuze and Guattari, it's like order words and the institution of language and, all this, gender roles and very interesting stuff. But an important part for Meinhof is the deployment of psychological warfare, which, of course, with the existence of the media today, is an ever more pressing concern, that the very notion of how a revolutionary struggle is perceived is enough to put out the fire of an important movement. The assumption on the part of everybody today that the ideal state of, for example, Israel and Palestine right now is a permanent ceasefire and permanent de-escalation of all conflict just ignores the fact that if we look at the material conditions of the strength of the IDF and the Israeli government, as opposed to the fraction of Fatah versus Hamas, as those political powers exist right now in a state of ceasefire, it will end in injustice for the Palestinian people. It will end in their land that they had 120 years ago, maybe, virtually completely wrested from them and then reduced to the state that they've been in prior to October 7th. Because, everyone today is so quick to forget the fact that the escalation in Gaza has happened way prior to October 7th. And that as such, pure pacifism is not necessarily going to coincide with justice. And as such, Meinhof is trying to reinsert into our minds the idea that violence can be justified for the purposes of liberation of the Palestinian people, for example, or in her case, the German people. And she mentions the CIA, among other people's uses as a puppet in order to force through their interests by blackmail, bribery, means of competition, protectionism, brutality, to cut a path across dead bodies. And if you know anything about the history of CIA involvement, whether this is in Central America, whether this is internal to the U.S. borders, whether this is in the Middle East, you know that the CIA is precisely there in order to incite foreign violence, in order to, for example, with the founding of Israel, creating a political tension which will ensure the continual imperialist presence. And as such, Meinhof wants to target these institutions as, in fact, using, freedom and democracy as an aegis for continued imperialist control. She writes, "The pigs count on fear in their psychological warfare against us. Fear which the system has burnt into the flesh of everyone, forced to sell their working energy just to be able to exist. They count on anti-communism, anti-Semitism, sexual repression, religion, authoritarian school systems, racism, brainwashing, through consumer culture, which has been directed against the people for decades, centuries." And this is a very real threat to the people's voice as such, is that, especially today in, a very kind of late-stage capitalist-oriented society, it is in fact corporations whose voices are being heard significantly more than the people's. And when the people's voices are heard, it's often very reactionary voices. In the case of, for example, Charles Balfour in the Balfour Declaration and in the lead up to the establishment of Israel, which was in fact an anti-Semitic policy aimed at confining the Jews to a space outside of Europe in order to expel them from Europe using the anti-Semitic tendencies that already existed. And as such, the establishment of the State of Israel established both a way to use anti-Semitism to get rid of Jews, and also a way to incite conflict in the Middle East in order to maintain imperialist hegemony. So the usage of the people's voice, Meinhof is pointing out, is often used in a reactionary way only to ensure that the state's goals get perpetuated. So in contrast to this, in situating oneself in this situation, she points out that the existence of the guerrilla fighter is built on, for her, a sober attachment to the conditions. It's not based on party lines or anything. It's based on living in conditions. She writes, "The guerrilla acts upon facts which people experience every day. Exploitation, media terror, insecurity of living conditions despite the great wealth and refined technology in this country. The psychic illnesses, suicides, child abuse, distress within the schools, the housing misery. What shocked the imperialist state about our first action was that the RAF has been perceived in the consciousness of the people as what it really is. The practice, the thing, which results logically and dialectically from present conditions. Action returns dignity to the people and meaning to their struggles, enabling the people to have a consciousness of their history." And this is a very Marxist point right here, but it is possibly a dangerous one when we bring in, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan right now. That Meinhof, of course, points to the RAF as the natural sublation of fascism. That as material conditions get worse, as fascism becomes stronger, as imperialism becomes stronger, the RAF is a natural outgrowth, a dialectic opposition to the present conditions, which is going to, of course, incite change and lead us to a greater society. But one of, for example, Jean Baudrillard's most important points in this context is that oftentimes the world is not dialectical. It is sworn to extremes. And because of, for example, the way the state volleys anti-communism, anti-Semitism, authoritarianism, racism, brainwashing in the case of the media, oftentimes what results is not a dialectically opposed struggle, but in actuality, a dialectical double of the imperialist entity, or of the authoritarian or oppressive entity in the case of the Taliban, in which as a dialectical sublation occurs, it doesn't occur in the direction of freedom. It occurs in the direction of Islamic fundamentalism, of terrorism, of the restriction of the freedom of women, for example. So while I think it is important to keep in mind the RAF is a practice, it is a thing which results from people's discontentment, that discontentment can also be used, of course, for very nefarious means. She continues, "In reference to the guerrilla, everyone can define for himself where he stands, is able, after all, to see for himself where he is standing, his position in the class society within imperialism." So, right, the existence of the guerrilla for Meinhof serves to elevate the class consciousness of people and get them to think critically about their condition. But she mentions that in response to this, many people are very willing to become complicit and virtue signal about being revolutionary, but when it comes actually time, they'll step on the brakes, as Meinhof puts it. She writes that this is the problem which Marx cited endless times, that a person is not what he claims, but what his real functions, his role in the class society defines him as. This is what, unless acting consciously against the system, i.e. taking up arms and fighting, he has been practically instrumentalized to be for the aims of the system. And, this is a very real problem, which is not as clear-cut either as Meinhof puts it or as her opponents put it. Because it is a real fact that people can be instrumentalized through the media, for example, to enter a pacified state, which can often be used. For example, people will swallow this notion that if you're opposed to the existence of the state of Israel as a legitimate political entity, that you're therefore anti-Semitic, when in actuality, it has nothing to do with racism or xenophobia, and it has everything to do with actually looking at the history of these institutions and rejecting their legitimacy. That is a perfect example in which a person can be instrumentalized based on their position in society and become complicit. And in using this revolutionary, humanist ideals, for example, can actually manufacture the human to be a reproduction of an imperialist model. And Meinhof points out that we must keep in mind that the people do not depend upon the state, but the state upon the people. And that the police was created not to protect people from criminals, but to protect the system of imperialism from the people. And if you doubt that last point, research the war in Algeria. I've done a very short lecture on the history of the Algerian War already, but you can look at, for example, the Maurice Line, in which, as a result of the escalations of the war in Algeria, particularly in the context of the Battle of Algiers around 1956, for example, when the French military presence increased from 56,000 troops to 83,000 troops, that's almost 30,000 additional troops, and the French government and police subsequently created the Maurice Line, which was really two lines that ran across the entirety of the western and eastern border of Algeria, the 10th largest country in the world, complete with electric fences, barbed wire, and landmines, in an effort to control and restrict the freedom of movement of Arabs. So, it is a very plausible reality that the police is in large part an establishment of the status quo, and that the very notion of the binarization of violence, that the police can use it, but you can't, in fact shows the binarization that occurs at the heart of the notion of the modern state, in which the state and the proletariat, the people who are actually working and creating the capital that the state uses, become two different entities. And in this moment, this is when, for her, anti-imperialist struggle becomes necessary. And she mentions that when it comes to, the dialectics of this situation, anti-imperialist struggle will escalate counter-revolution. It will incite the state to oppose one with greater force. But as she says, by his own terror, he makes the masses rise against him, allows contradictions to escalate, and thus forces the revolutionary struggle. And this he, in this context, is the state. That in using its own terror, the state has no possibility but to go against these struggles which are aimed at the state's dissolution. And that in so doing this, as she quotes A.P. Pouillon here, through the pressure of the worsening counter-revolutionary force against the resistance fighters, all other controlled groups and classes will inevitably become even more suppressed. Thus, the ruling class intensifies the contradictions between itself and the suppressed classes, and by creating such an atmosphere, which will come by force of things, it pushes the political consciousness of the masses way ahead. And then she also quotes Marx, where he says, Revolutionary progress determines its direction when it rouses a powerful, self-centered counter-revolution by engendering an adversary that can only cause the insurgent party to evolve in its battle against the counter-revolutionaries into a veritable revolutionary party. And all of this is to say that, contrary to the notion that the revolutionary party exists separated from the state, in fact, Meinhof is trying to show that the very existence of armed guerrilla groups depends upon the conditions which have been set up by the state, in which, as a result, incite a reaction, which incites a counter-reaction, and in this play, in this escalation, brings to mind, for example, in the War of Algeria, with all these student protests going on, and, for example, the massacre in Sétif, these escalations bring to mind struggles that people weren't aware of, oftentimes more so by the existence of the counter-revolution, through the way the French police reacted, not the Algerian revolutionaries, often incited more reason to mount a revolutionary struggle than did the FLN, for example. As such, she points out, for example, when the Pigs in 1972 created a total mobilization with a staff of 150,000 in their search for the RAF, all materials and personnel forces of this state were set into motion because of a small number of revolutionaries. It became evident on a material level that the force monopoly of the state is limited. Its powers can be exhausted. And this is a mal-reference. Tactically speaking, imperialism is a man-eating monster, but strategically it is a paper tiger. It became evident on a material level that it is up to us whether suppression continues, and it is up to us as well whether it will be smashed. So in giving this example of the counter-revolutionary police mobilization of 150,000 in their search for, for example, Andrés Bada, we get a similar situation to in the war in Algeria, when the French police presence that was increasingly in Algeria weakened the French state to the point of dissolving the Fourth Republic of France. So in this way, the very existence of an armed anti-imperialist struggle acts as a method by which change actually occurs. Now, all of this is very important to keep in mind, but what is equally important to keep in mind is the aftermath of not only this essay, but the rest of Ulrike Meinhof's life. Meinhof was herself imprisoned and committed suicide in prison, hanging herself by the bars of her own prison cell and a cloth. Meinhof wrote a letter from a prisoner in isolation, and a selection reads as follows: the feeling that one's head is exploding, the feeling that the brain is shriveling up like a baked fruit, the feeling that one is being controlled remotely, the feeling that all one's associations are being cut away, the feeling of pissing the soul out of one's body like someone who can no longer hold water, the raging aggressiveness for which there is no outlet. That's the worst, the clear understanding that one has no chance of survival. And this represents the unfortunate situation of left-wing politics in general, of decentralization and consolidation and globalization, of modern economies and politics. And I think this is likely motivating her suicide. As Kathy Acker writes in Algeria, suicide and self-destruction is the first way the shitted on start showing anger against the shitters. As such, Meinhof was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment on November 29th, 1974, and other members, including Andrés Bada and Enzlen and Jan Karl Raspe, were jointly charged on August 19th of 1975 with 4 counts of murder, 54 of attempted murder, and a single count of forming a criminal association. Before this trial was concluded, Meinhof was found hung by a rope fashioned from a towel in Stammheim on May 9th, 1976. It is highly probable that she herself likely would have been sentenced to life imprisonment plus 15 years, as were the remainder of the people after Meinhof's suicide. And that concludes this very emotionally jarring lecture. Hopefully this has been insightful in learning about left-wing politics in post-war Germany, in leftist politics with regards to violence, and how this makes one reconsider and put into new light the current situation in Gaza. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, on German idealism, on gender theory, on postcolonial studies. Leave any constructive or non-constructive comments in the comment section below, and I'll see you in another video.